we're so glad that you all could be here. This is something that I did last year actually with Dr. Prash, because with the university's push for the grad showcase, more and more of our students are doing poster presentations, which is awesome. But through many informal conversations with students, it became very clear that y'all don't get a lot of professional development around how to do a poster presentation. Even very simple logistics like where the heck do I get a poster printed can be pretty complicated when you don't have that information. So I'm super happy to have Dr. Elkins helping with this presentation, and so we're going to try and provide you with sort of balanced perspectives around the different expectations when it comes to poster presentations, whether you're doing sort of more of a social scientific project or whether you're doing more of a humanities focused project. So I'm going to go ahead and start, and I'll start by just talking through some very basic like ins and outs of doing a strong poster presentation, and these will be true sort of regardless of where you're presenting, be it the grad show, be it NCA, be it Western, or some other conference in the future. And this will be true regardless of what sort of research paradigm your poster is coming out of. And so where to start? As Julie Andrews once wonderfully said, let's start at the very beginning, a very good place to start. When it comes to starting your poster, one of the very important and essential things to do is to start by really defining your purpose. One of the biggest challenges of doing a poster presentation as compared to other types of academic presentations is you have to be much more concise in how you're talking about your work and talking about your project. And so taking this, this paper, this project, that maybe started and was 20, 30 pages long, and figuring out how to talk about it in 2 to 3 minutes, and then figuring out how to condense and represent that in sort of a very compelling fashion on just like one piece of sort of 3x4 paper can be really challenging. So a great place to start is defining your purpose. And one way to think about this is, what do you want the people who are passing by your poster to do? Do you want them to stop and ask you a question? Do you want them to stop and listen to sort of your full prepared spiel about what your poster is about? Do you want them to think, that's interesting, and just keep walking, right? Depending on what you want people to do, that should shape and drive the way you approach constructing your poster. So before you even start trying to build this, just think for a minute on what it is that you want people to do when it comes to your poster. Another thing that's really important to do is to establish your priorities. So you'll have this overarching goal, and then underneath it, you should have some sort of sub-goals or smaller things that you want to accomplish that will help you lead to sort of that bigger, more positive audience interaction. And when you're thinking about your priorities, questions like, what is the most interesting, unique, compelling finding from your research? That's a really good one to highlight, because that can help you get to that place where you're beginning to condense your ideas into what is most essential for your poster and your presentation. How can I visually share my research with attendees? This is one of the sort of great strengths of poster presentations, but for many of us, one of like the great areas of kryptonite when it comes to poster presentations. We work so hard and we get so good at representing our work and our ideas textually that when we have to flip that around and actually represent our ideas visually, we can get stuck. And that's one of the things that's really essential to doing a great poster presentation, is being able to think about and represent your ideas in a visually compelling way. So spend some time on that question about what's going to make sense. And so for you, it may be an image, it may be a chart or a graph, right? It may be a table. Any of those ways of visually representing your work can be really compelling if done right, and only you could know what's going to make the most sense for your research and for your project. Other questions, what kind of information can I convey during my talk? In particular, for those of you who are preparing for the grad show, you will be speaking to audiences who are not from your field, who do not have a background in communication studies. And so it's going to be incredibly important that you really think about sharing your research, sharing your ideas in ways that will translate across audiences. That's less of a concern when it comes to sort of academic specific conferences like NCA, Western, SCMS, right? When you have people who share some baseline knowledge with you. But you want to think about, what can I convey during my talk based on the time limits I have and based on who I know my audience is going to be. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute. And so considering your audience is that other really essential piece of the puzzle. Again, the graduate showcase judges are not going to be from your department. As somebody who has now judged grad showcase the past 2 years, will judge it again, I almost always am listening to like robotics presentations, right? Things that are so far afield of anything that I do, and having to make sense of the information that they're sharing. So really thinking critically about how can I describe this in a way that is really accessible to people who may never have taken a communication studies class, and in reality, when it comes to our field, may think they really know what communication is, right? But we know that it's actually more complicated than that. And so being aware of sort of who those people are and where they're coming from is really important. And then, again, recognizing that other opportunities will share more of that background knowledge, and so tailoring based on sort of who those people are going to be. And again, use some of your really excellent pedagogical training right through the public speaking class. How much do you hammer on your students the importance of audience analysis and of paying attention to who it is you're talking to? It's time to live that. It's time to practice what we teach, right? And so this is a great moment to do that. So these are some of the things that you should really start doing before you even think about what your poster is going to look like, because defining these priorities, setting these goals for yourself, and knowing who your audience are going to be are crucial decisions to make early on in order to have a poster that's going to be compelling and that's going to translate to your different audiences. I should have said at any point in time, if you have questions, please ask. All right, so you've done that thought work, right? You've done the more sort of challenging cognitive task of thinking about what's most important and what your goals are and who you're going to be talking to. And so now you have to build your poster. So let's talk about some of the general do's and don'ts of building a compelling academic poster. So one of the number one do's is to make sure that you know the size expectations for your poster. There will be different conventions at different conferences, at different presentation opportunities. So a great place to start when you're building your poster is to know what size it should be. And so I can tell you right now, hey, in general, sizing for posters is either 3 feet by 4 feet, right? That's the horizontal layout, so it's a little bit longer than it is tall, or flipping that and doing 4 by 3. This is the standard size expectation for the CSU grad show. So for those of you who are staring down grad show in a couple of weeks, this is the size you will need to do. When it comes to printing your poster, CSU has great resources available for you here that will be so much easier and so much less expensive than trying to go get your poster done somewhere like Staples. And so there is printing available in the Morgan Library for any poster presentations. There are detailed instructions on the Morgan Library website about how you do that, and there are also people there who can help you troubleshoot how to do that. So when it comes to your poster, some very basic logistical information for here at CSU, make sure you know your size. For CSU presentations, it's 3 by 4 or 4 by 3. And then know that you can get it printed at the Morgan Library and save yourself a whole lot of pain and suffering and money by trying to take it somewhere else to have it be done. Another important thing to do with your poster is to choose sort of an eye-catching and pithy title. We in academia really love our super long, colon and semicolon, 25-word titles, and I am 100% guilty of that. For your poster presentation, let's think about how you can condense that, right? So maybe your poster title is in really large letters, whatever came before that colon, because let's be honest, I'm guessing pretty much every poster had a colon in there somewhere, right? So let's think about your title maybe being what came before that colon, or being some catchy sort of boiled down version of whatever the formal title you submitted to the grad show is. That's fine, but that title is going to be the first thing people see, the first thing they process about your poster, and having a 50-word title is overwhelming. As sort of an audience member, as a judge, when I'm walking by poster after poster and I see these titles that are just these giant blocks of text, my reaction is, that's probably interesting, but that's going to take me even too much time to fully read the title to even know whether it's something I want to ask about. So again, thinking about your priorities, for many of you, right, you actually want people to engage with you. One of the kindest things you can do for yourself around that is choosing a title that's going to work for you. When it comes to your poster, shoot for an overall word total on your poster that is between 300 and 800 words. For most people, the sweet spot is around that 500-word mark. Less than 300 words, and you may find that you're not sharing enough information. more than 800 words, and I can guarantee you you're trying to cram too much in there, and it's not going to be readable to your audience. So again, this is a range. There are posters that can have less, there are posters that can have more, and still be very good, compelling posters, but in general, this is the appropriate range. When it comes to those words that you are using, all of your fonts should be readable from 10 feet away. So if a poster is up here and a person probably is standing in the back of the room, they should be able to read what is on your poster. And so when you're thinking about your font size, that's what you need to be thinking about. So one thing that you can do is as you're building your poster, this is a little bit bigger than 3x4, but as you're building your poster, you can actually bring it in here and try it out on your computer and see if the screen works for you. And see if you can read it from standing in the back of the room. That's a small thing you can do to make sure that everything is legible. Make sure that your text is clear and consistently formatted. We'll talk about text hierarchies in just a minute. And maybe this is me just being a little bit anal, but there's nothing that drives me more crazy than seeing like 18 different fonts on a poster, right? It's visually overwhelming. And so make sure that you choose your text appropriately and that you're formatting them consistently throughout. Use bullet points. They are your friend. Again, this is something that you will not ever be told to do in any of your academic coursework, but for a poster presentation, bullet points are very effective. They're very helpful in breaking up your information into more manageable chunks. So use bullet points appropriately. When it comes to choosing your fonts, general recommendations are that you use a serif font for your body text, right? Does everybody know what serif fonts are? Serif fonts are fonts like Times New Roman, where on the sort of different sort of elements of the letter, they have those little hash marks. Serif fonts are much easier to read on printed material, whereas sans serif fonts are easier to read in digital material, right? So I have done my presentation in a sans serif font knowing that you're going to be looking at it on a screen. However, on a printed poster, a serif font will be easier to read. The exception is sans serif fonts are very compelling for titles, for headings, right, where it's just a word or a phrase, right? It's not a whole chunk of text. They can be very bold, very clean, very nice, and then the more lengthy pieces of your text in a serif font. Just general recommendations. I don't have specific fonts to give you, but generally sans serif for titles and headings, serif for your text body. Make sure that you're using graphics and pictures effectively. Again, this is one of the elements of posters that's a little bit different than other types of academic presentations. You actually get to visually represent your research. And I'll talk a little bit more about some general design suggestions about how to do that and do that well in just a minute. So again, one of the greatest differences between poster presentations and other presentations is this is where your poster is really going to sell itself. This is where it's really going to be effective and compelling, is your ability to use visuals and not just to rely on like 3 columns of just text. Thinking with what goes on your poster, make sure that you are using white space wisely. And general recommendations say you should shoot for between 25 to 40% of your poster functioning as white space, meaning it's not housing an image, it's not housing a table or figure, and it doesn't have text on it. That's quite a bit of your poster, but it's really important in order to make sure your poster doesn't feel crammed, cluttered, and just overwhelming for the eye. So make sure that you're using white space appropriately. Questions about any of this? All right, we'll keep going then. Other elements for building your poster. Again, thinking about the logistics of building your poster, I strongly encourage that you use PowerPoint to actually build your poster. PowerPoint is one of the easiest mediums to use for this. Again, if you're an Adobe expert, right? Adobe has different programs that you can use, but in general, all students have access to PowerPoint. It's a pretty universal software program to be able to use. The Morgan Library can take that and process that pretty easily to print your poster, so use PowerPoint to build your poster. And when you're doing that, there are templates that are available for you on the Grad Showcase website, as well as other websites. There are templates for building a poster, though I want to strongly recommend that you make sure you customize the templates. As with all things template, what is common and what happens often is that so many people take the templates and just use them as is, and then you show up to a presentation and there are 30 other people who have a poster that looks pretty much identical to yours. That's not what you want. But these templates can be really valuable in giving you sort of a backbone, in making sure that you're working on something that will be the right size, again, remembering that sizing component, and then in helping you sort of highlight some of the common ways to set up the different sections of a poster. So again, the Grad Showcase website has a bunch of really good templates that you can use, but make sure that you're not just taking the templates and slapping your information in there. You really want to make sure you customize it. Make sure that you're consistent in your color palettes and keep sort of your colors professional. Pay attention to accessibility when it comes to color. A significant portion of people in the US do have different types of color blindness, so making sure that you're being careful with the use of colors like red or green, the most common colors that people experience issues with when it comes to color blindness, is a good recommendation. And when it comes to colors, you want to stick with very readable colors for your actual text. So that would be black on white, white on black, or some form of like bolder color on gray. You probably don't want to play with color too much when it comes to the font of your text, but you can play with color in other ways and in other elements on your poster. As you're designing your poster, use a general grid to make sure that you're sort of keeping things aligned and organized. And so the most common grid that you'll see for posters is usually a 3-column grid with sort of a row cut out at the bottom and a row cut out at the top. So your title's at the top. You have 3 columns where you're putting your information and pictures, and then at the bottom you have a small row where you're putting your contact information, where you're putting references, things like that. So make sure that you're using some sort of grid or organization. So yours may not be 3 columns, that's fine, right? But make sure you're using some sort of grid or organization in order to keep those elements organized. And make sure that you're using a clearly established text hierarchy. So what that means is if you choose a text for your headings, that you are using it consistently for all of your headings. And that you very clearly spelled out for yourself, like, okay, the title is this font, headings are this font, subheadings are this font, body text is this font. And that you're being consistent in how you're applying your text hierarchy. If items go together in your presentation, in your research, make sure that you are putting them near one another on your poster. And so again, this is where some of the conventions of ways that posters are typically formatted come from, in that, right, your literature review usually leads into your research questions or your hypotheses. And so it makes sense on your poster that those things are going to be near one another, and that you're not going to have your literature review and your research questions all the way over here. Again, that doesn't feel visually right to the eye. It doesn't make sense for the flow of your presentation. So if things go together, make sure that you are putting them near each other physically on your poster. Keep in mind, as you're designing your poster, the Z of good design. And I meant to ask Carol if there's like a technical term for this. This is a concept that I learned in my editing, layout, and design class as an undergrad student that I've carried with me. And once you learn it, you can like never unsee it. It is everywhere. So when it comes to, the Z of good design, we'll get back to that, I guess. When it comes to the Z of good design, I should have put that bullet point later, but we'll talk about that in just a minute. Basically, it's all about how the eye, at least in countries where we read text from left to right, it's all about how the eye naturally flows on sort of visual medium, and positioning elements in your poster to take advantage of that. We'll look at some examples in a minute. Other things to remember when building your poster: make sure you include your name and your affiliation. That would seem obvious, but I've definitely seen posters where people forgot that. So make sure you put your name, your affiliation, obviously your department, Colorado State University. That's important information. For posters generally, and this is across the spectrum, including social scientific posters and humanities poster, include some version of the purpose, right? What your research was designed to address, the problem that it's recognizing, the text that it's evaluating, right? Put some representation of what your purpose is on your poster. And then make sure that you outline something related to your research procedure or process. If you're presenting a poster where you have not done the research yet, You should outline ideas about what you think the research procedure or process should look like, and that's perfectly appropriate. You want to outline your results or outcomes, right? What you found, how you answered those questions you had, how you responded to those hypotheses. And again, if you're presenting research in progress where you don't have firm outcomes, you can present what you think your outcomes are going to be, and that's appropriate. And then you want to make sure you talk about the implications and the future directions. And especially for your audience, these are the things they're going to be really interested to hear about, right? This is where you really spell out clearly why your research matters and what can be done next, how it's building theory, how it's addressing very real-world problems and challenges, right? So you're going to want to make sure it's clear what is valuable about what you have done or about what you are planning to do in your poster. Again, we'll talk more about what these look like in just a minute as we break it down and think about what a more social scientific poster looks like and what a more humanities poster looks like. But all posters should include elements of these as appropriate in some way. Make sure that you list all of the references that you are citing on your poster towards the bottom of your poster. So again, you should not have all of the references from your paper on your poster, but you are certainly going to be citing other people's work. And so you want to make sure that those make it onto your poster. Though, pro tip, if you don't have space, this is where coming up with a half sheet or quad sheet handout where you have some of that extra information can be really valuable. And so that's one thing to keep in mind as you're building your poster. If there's information that really essentially needs to be on your poster, like references, but are not actually key to sort of your work or your findings, having a quad sheet or a half sheet of paper where you have this information printed out that can be given to people is a really great way to sort of meet the needs you have to not plagiarize people, while also making sure that you preserve as much space as possible for the things that you think are really important for your poster. And there are other ways you can do this too. Maybe you want to include a table with participant demographics, and that doesn't fit great on your poster, but you think it's important information people are going to want to know. Cool, put it on a half sheet or a quad sheet. The rule with that, though, is you really do want to keep it to being about a half sheet or a quad sheet. Don't hand people like 5 pages front and back stapled together of like all of these pieces that you wish you would have put on your poster, but that didn't make it. Because chances are that's not all going to be super pertinent, relevant information. Okay, now we're going to talk about the visual Z. So the visual Z, again, is this concept in design about how our eyes tend to just travel across medium. And again, once you see it, you can't unsee it. So I just have some sample magazine covers up here. But the way our eyes naturally travel across any visual medium is in a Z. We tend to pay attention to what's at top first, sort of cut our way across, and then go to the bottom. And as you look at these different magazine covers, they are designed to accommodate that from readers, right? So you have the magazine title, you have some of the sort of interesting story titles here, and then like down at the bottom you have that big piece, right? So in all of these stories you can see there's this Z happening, and as you process the images, your eyes are likely to move in this Z formation. And so it is, again, a universal thing in so much as in countries where we read from left to right. This tends to be the natural way where our eyes process visual information. And so when you are thinking about designing your poster, it's a great idea to think about how you can take advantage of that visual Z, knowing that the people who are walking by your poster, that is the quick snap judgment they're going to use to sort of make decisions about whether they're going to talk to you, whether they're going to ask you questions, right? Your judges are going to be processing that information really quickly. And so if you can harness in your own poster elements of that Z, you can create something that's very visually compelling without maybe necessarily putting as much work into figuring out how everything's going to be on there. So thinking about taking advantage of that visual Z can be very important. And I'm sure it's called something real and fancy other than the visual Z, but I can't remember what it's called. I just remember what it is. So we'll call it the visual Z. So I want to show you just a quick example. This is an example of sort of what not to do with a poster. And so you can see that in this poster, there are several elements that are actually really strong, right? We have that very clear sort of grid format where we have those 3 columns, right? We have the top sort of up here where they've had their title and their author information. But in general, there's so much going on here, right? There's no way somebody from 10 feet away would be able to read all of this. And it would take them easily 15 to 20 minutes to actually read all of this. That's not valuable for a poster presentation. And so, again, there are some good visual representations on this poster, but they're pretty cluttered. And overall, this poster is pretty overwhelming in terms of where to look, what to pay attention to, what to see. And so, again, some things they've done really well, right? They've got their grid going. They've got sort of a very clear big title at the top. They're obviously using their color formatting very consistently. But man, it's really overwhelming. So lots of good information in this poster. I'm sure they worked really hard on it, but not the best way to visually represent information. And so here's a poster that's a little bit better, but how else could it be improved? So this is better in that you still have that clear grid system at the top. There's more white space, and recognizing the image is fuzzy quality. But what are things that you would do to make this poster look a little bit better?
Reduce columns.
Okay.
If you could.
Mm-hmm. Yep, so reduce your columns so they're not quite so fat. What else?
Align those pictures, like the big blocks, so they're actually consistent.
Yes, right. Isn't that a little bit maddening where there are these three visuals
They're the same size.
right, and they're good pictures, but they're all slightly off from one another, and it just doesn't feel organized. Though again, I'm sure the person who put this together worked really hard to make something very intentionally, that they thought was compelling, but it's a little maddening. And in part, it's because, again, thinking about that Z, right, our eyes dip because there's a big image here, and then we have to veer back up, and then there's nowhere for our eye to go over here. We get lost in sort of this fun text world, and then we end up back here, and it just doesn't feel right. It feels off. Other things that you would do to adjust this poster. Yeah, Julia.
Yeah, first I was thinking of moving that first picture up
Mhm.
and switching in, and then making those two text boxes in that column bigger too, because
Mhm.
there's a lot of white space. I think white space
Mhm.
is good too, but that text is so small.
Yep, the text is small. There maybe is a little bit too much white space, right? Whereas with the other poster, it felt like way too full. And now we hit this poster, I'm like, well, this one feels a little bit empty, right? So finding that right balance. Other things you would suggest.
I'm not sure about the boxes around the captions underneath the pictures.
Yes. Yep, boxes around captions. And the fact that they have their grid lines visible is a pretty big no-no when it comes to posters. You want to use a grid, you want to sort of use column format, but you don't want to print that on your poster. You want it to be obvious in that when people look at it, it's very clearly delineated and it makes sense to them, but you don't actually want to be and here are the lines from the boxes that I drew in my head, when I was designing this. That's a really good catch. Anything else?
This is really minor, but
Yeah.
in each of those smaller text boxes, the heading is aligned, the left line is at one spot, and then all the text is an inch or so in,
Mm-hmm.
which would be cool, good on paper, but it just seems odd
Mm-hmm.
on a poster format.
Yeah, so paying attention to indentations, things like that, you're exactly right, where they're offset from one another, and that maybe doesn't feel like it makes the most sense or is the most organized in this representation. Yeah. Lots of good thoughts about things that could be done to make this poster a little bit stronger. But definitely, right, compared to the other poster had its problems, but this one, okay, we can at least process this. Even if it isn't always a totally seamless, pleasant experience, we can make sense of this poster. All right. So when it comes to prepping your presentation, right, we've been talking about how to do your poster, but of course, there's this whole other side of your presentation that is actually talking and actually sharing your information in a very concise way with judges at the grad show or with just general audience members in other settings. And so, in particular for the grad show, make sure that you are keeping your presentation short. And short is 2 to 3 minutes long. Right, so you really have that first 20 seconds to sort of hook your audience members, and then you have, after that, another 1.5 to 2 minutes to really sell the merits of your work. And so you want to spend the majority of that time on your remarkable findings, your insights, the really intelligent argument that you're making. Again, thinking back to those questions that we asked about sort of what is the most compelling thing from your research, that's what you want to spend the most time talking about. And it's going to feel funky because you're going to want to spend a lot of time talking about all the lit review you've done and all the research, and you're going to want to spend time talking about, in very detailed ways, your method and how you approached your text or how you approached your participants. No. Talk about what is most interesting and important and relevant from what you found. That's where you should spend your time. And again, remember your audience. Make sure you're accessing your amazing training through teaching public speaking, right? And thinking about that audience and then thinking about what makes a really good 2 to 3 minute speech. And I always recommend by closing your talk by inviting your audience member to ask questions or comments or provide feedback. That's a very clear signal to them that, like, you are done with your spiel and now they can give you feedback if they want to, and if they don't, cool, you've just had this lovely interaction and they can move on. If you want to see examples of what very excellent 2 to 3 minute presentations look like, the Grad Show has several video recorded examples on their website. And in fact, your ability to do this well can qualify you for sort of a second competition where there's a lot of money to be won by doing really compelling 2 to 3 minute pitches. So the Grad Show is pretty invested in that. And I believe very confidently that all of you have a nice like one-up on everybody else, and that you've all had this really excellent training and you've spent a lot of time already thinking about what good public speaking looks like. And so you should all be hopefully set up for success. I believe that. I believe in you all. Questions, comments? All right.
Yeah, well, I'll just sort of jump in to say that, I mean, I think from kind of the humanities, sort of rhetoric and media studies sort of perspectives, I mean, I wouldn't offer a whole lot of advice that is really that different. I mean, I think that, I think, you mentioned this, right, but even in a kind of humanistic presentation, right, you really should present essentially the same things, right? So the research questions, the purpose, what you're trying to sort of figure out, right? Methods and approaches, perhaps kind of maybe blended in with sort of a little kind of bit of literature review or sort of like background and how you're going about this. And then, conclusions or, possible conclusions and references. I mean, I think it might be challenging to translate more kind of discursive and long-winded humanistic writing to this format, right? But I think it's incredibly useful. I think any of these kinds of projects or anything where you have to take kind of all of this stuff that you're working through and figuring out, and whether it's like an application or a letter or a poster, right? But in kind of boiling it down into its most essential fundamental component parts, you should come away understanding your own project better, I think, because that really sort of forces you to do that kind of. It's not easy to just sit down and like write 40 pages, right? But that's a way of kind of like sort of working through a lot of stuff as you're working on something. But forcing yourself to kind of boil it down will, I think, let you know your own project better. In terms of things, some of the design elements, I mean, I think, it's a lot of the same kinds of things. I mean, you can think about how different sorts of rhetoric or media-focused projects might incorporate some of these things, like images, for example. If you're doing a film analysis, it makes sense to think about screenshots. If you're doing any kind of sort of visual rhetoric, right? Like it's a good opportunity to offer visual examples of the kinds of things you're looking at, right? And not to overwhelm them, but again, think about like what is a sort of what's a kind of sample image or, photograph or screenshot or artwork or what have you, that you're looking at. I think, one thing to think about, because I tend to work with folks who do internet analysis and kind of look at online spaces and the ways that people are interacting through there. I mean, generally and broadly, you obviously want to be thinking about and stay consistent with, if you have an IRB for something like that, or generally kind of like staying consistent with that in terms of things like confidentiality. And so for, if you want to use screenshots from, say, an online discourse or something, just think about the same guidelines that you would in terms of something you're writing up, but knowing that it is going to be sort of publicly available and accessible, right? If you're analyzing the president's tweets, right, like that's fair game. He's a public figure. It would be a little odd to kind of blur out his like username and face, right? But if you are looking at publicly accessible, comments on something like Reddit or something like that, in terms of kind of analysis, it's fair game, but you may want to just kind of err on the side of caution and not include people's usernames, that sort of thing, right? If they're not kind of like visibly public figures, or if it's not immediately relevant. That's a fairly specific thing to think about, but yeah, I guess just being sort of using good judgment on that sort of thing. And yeah, I mean, I would really just again stress the, again, something that I think will cause and force you to know your own project better is really stressing that audience element of you're not even going to be talking to other humanists probably. I mean, maybe some, but you're going to be talking with people in various STEM fields. You're going to be talking with people all over campus. Those are going to be people who are judging your presentations. Again, as you mentioned, right? Not so much at a conference, although even there, you are going to have to do some translating, right? But really think about how you're going to present this in a way that assumes no baseline knowledge, right? And then, as you talk with folks, you can kind of ascertain like the degree to which they do or don't have some kind of like background or idea of sort of what you're, what you're working on. But as a general rule, I mean, I think especially for grad show, you should assume no baseline knowledge. Again, like and what that means is also be prepared for some questions that might seem potentially out there, right? Or that might seem basic to you, but that aren't basic to someone else, right? Like, I mean, as a grad show judge, right, I'm sure I know I asked questions where I saw, folks respond in a way that's like either like, well, that question makes no sense, or that is a really stupid question, right? Like you're gonna get some of that, and it's just by virtue of talking with folks who are like completely outside of your field. So just kind of be aware of that. Watch out for jargon. And again, I think it is a thing that will cause you to know what you're doing better than you did before, because you are going to be in that position of like, I'm going to need to be able to tell any possible person who comes up to me what I'm doing here. So, I think those are a lot of the sort of pieces of advice I have. I mean, again, in spite of the differences between humanities and social science work, I mean, I think broadly you should approach building a poster, more or less the same way in terms of kind of the fundamentals. But.
As someone who generally does like textual analysis, so like the poster that I presented is public address, or even I guess for like interview studies and things where you have like lots of text to work with, how much should we put on the poster of like excerpts or things like that that are demonstrating the points you're making? They don't have to be really long.
I mean, I would say as a general rule, I mean, one thing I think you could do first is to try out a few different sort of possibilities, right? But I mean, I think as a general rule, you'll be surprised, like even if it doesn't seem like it's a lot of text to you, once it's kind of laid out there, it might still look like a lot, right? So I think thinking about ways to, I mean, I guess depending on what you're doing, right, you could include sort of like an image of a written letter or something, which is like maybe a little bit different. Maybe that reads a little bit more as an image. But I think to maybe including very short, abridged excerpts, perhaps set off in like a larger font, like you would see like a pull quote in a magazine article or something. That's certainly a possibility. But you may still then find that it is feeling a little text heavy, and you might be somewhat more kind of boxed into including an image of the person or people or groups or whomever that you're.
Yeah, and I would just echo Dr. Elkins' comment. I would try treating some of those really important quotes almost like an image, right? So how can you like box them and change the font, and make it look visually different and distinct from your voice and your text? And that can be a way to sort of treat that and make that more eye-catching and make your poster look less just like, oh my gosh, there's so much text, and more like, okay, here are the things I know I should be paying attention to. And another option, too, is you can think about, if there are quotes you think are really important to highlight in your argument, but they don't fit on your poster, maybe that's what goes on your quad sheet or your half sheet, right? And you can provide people with more of that textual evidence that you feel like is really core to the argument you're making without it all having to be on your poster.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Kind of related to that, how much does the presentation, so the actual talk, like integrate with the poster as opposed to like reiterate what's already on the poster? So like, if we're using Lauren's example, if she has those big text-based like ideas on there or the quotes, how much should be described underneath it on the actual poster as opposed to just like spoken out loud?
Again, I think it's a balancing act, and it's kind of trying to figure out what feels appropriate. So your presentation should, in many ways, be an even further boiled down version of your poster, right? So when you're presenting what is coming out of your mouth about your presentation, the person who is looking at your poster should be able to sort of track what you are saying by being able to relate to elements of your poster. If what you are talking about feels wholly different or widely divorced from your poster, that's not good. And so, so that question of like having text-heavy elements, Lauren could certainly point to those pull quotes on her poster without having to read those quotes loud, because in 2 to 3 minutes you're just not going to be able to read very many quotes. And so you want those things to sort of go together. And again, right, your poster is like this very condensed version of your paper. Your talk is this very condensed version. So it's like those nesting dolls, right, where you just open and it just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So I don't know if you have thoughts to add on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing to keep in mind is that people can't listen and read at the same time unless it's, the same thing, right? So, so you shouldn't expect or think about it, I think, in terms of, well, I'm going to say this part, and then they're going to read this other part, and like these two pieces are separate, and they like come together. Because in practice, that's not going to work, because it's just going to like kind of overwhelm. Yeah. So yeah, I think being able to present and speak kind of the main parts, and then maybe the poster is like there are bullet points that correspond with that, or maybe here's like an image or equation or whatever it is, right? That like we might be able to kind of sort of look at and sort of piece together as the person is sort of hearing the thing, right? But like just remembering that hearing spoken language and reading text that are different at the same time just isn't gonna work, and is gonna lead to probably the person coming away with not as much of an idea of what's going on, right?
Yeah, that's great. Other questions, comments?
Yeah, it's not really a question, but I'm actually submitting under entrepreneurial.
Yep.
So,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm gonna take a lot of these ideas,
Mhm.
and I wanna include theory too, but, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I will tell you, the suggested sort of components that I outlined and that Dr. Elkins and I both talked about, those are things that are suggested by the grad show for all presentations, with the exception of performance, right? Because performance is just a totally different thing. So even for the entrepreneurial presentations, still being able to talk about like the purpose of your product, the purpose of what it is you've designed, the problem it's going to address, like the implications of it sort of in the bigger, broader world and how it's going to make the world a better place or how it's going to solve this issue. Those look a little bit different than the way we would think about it for a research presentation, but at the core of it, it still is sort of the same thing. And so that's another thing that you might think about too is, if you have an example of a thing, right? So if you have an example, I just happen to know Julia, right? It's an app, right? If you have a demo of your app, that's great to bring it. Taylor's doing her presentation at Grad Show on VR. She's going to take one of our VR headsets, right? So people could put it on and see it. And so, for people who are doing text or for doing visual media, like maybe you have, like a key, document that, copies of a document that you're going to bring that's sort of like almost like a prop to sort of be like, and here's some of where this data is coming from. That's another sort of cheat of getting around some of the limitations of a poster and some of the limitations of a space, but still doing it in a very compelling and visually creative way that you can't do in like a paper. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that it's a good point, right? That even, this is a maybe somewhat limited framework of like kind of academic poster presentations, but a lot of the kind of general ideas are applicable beyond that, and I think that's a good example. And I think, presumably, like most, if not all, folks doing grad show or whatever from this department are likely not doing sort of like presenting creative projects or, kind of like visual art or something, but that may not necessarily be the case. And I think that, as a grad show judge, like I, judged a couple of photography and sort of visual art posters. And, even though, obviously that's going to contain more sort of visual or more image elements, I'm still looking for some of those same kind of fundamental things. Like, what was the purpose of and goals of this project? What did you hope to achieve, and do you think you achieved that? And what is this project sort of saying or proposing? So yeah.
So you're doing judging this year, but you're not?
I am.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
I'm actually not, only because it clashes with my teaching, but I did it last year.
I'm gonna like run over there after a meeting and like do all mine in like a really quick 45 minutes and then like run back and go to my next meeting. But yeah, it's a really cool experience. It's fun to be involved in, I hope, as graduate students, but I can certainly say it's fun to be involved in as a faculty member. It's a great opportunity to see what people from all across the university in really diverse fields of inquiry are examining and thinking about and contributing to bigger, broader cultural and scholarly conversations. So I like doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's
Awesome.
300.
Oh yeah,
A lot.
it's big.
That's cool.
You will show up to the ballroom and you will walk in and be like, holy cow, this is so, and like during sort of the heyday of the judging, right, like maneuvering between like all of the different posters, it gets very, very full and very busy in there. So be prepared to project a little bit. I mean, you won't be like yelling across the room, right, because your judge will be right there with you, but be prepared to project because it can get pretty loud.
Yeah. It's chaotic, but it's fun chaos.
Yeah,
I think
it is.
like
It
it
really
really is a really exciting environment. So
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank y'all for coming.
yeah.
Thank